Michael Clarke is Professor of Defense Studies and Sky News military analyst. Welcome to our program, Professor Clarke.
Daniel, it's nice to be with you again.
Ukrainian drones have caused the largest disruption to Russia's oil refining system since the beginning of the full-scale war. According to Reuters, Russia's oil refineries shut down at record levels, according to Reuters calculations. What is your assessment of this new Ukrainian approach to waging war inside Russia?
Well, it's certainly working in its own terms. By some estimates, about 11% of Russia's refining capacity has been affected. By other estimates, United States estimates say up to 20%. So it's something significant. And clearly what the government in Kyiv is trying to do is not to affect the supply of oil outside Russia, because that's a different question, and that would have a direct impact on global prices of oil, which would be a problem for the United States, amongst others. So Ukraine is very careful not to do that. And if the price of oil increases because of the war, it won't be because of what Ukraine is doing. That's the message. But it's possible for Ukraine to affect the price of oil internally in Russia, of the price of refined products and petrol. So the wholesale price of petroleum has increased 55% since the beginning of this year. Now, the retail price in Russia has only increased by about 10% because the government is actually subsidizing the price of petrol because of the rise in the wholesale price. But sooner or later, that increase in the wholesale price, which will probably go on increasing, that increase will filter through to the real economy. So Ukraine has found a lever here to affect the Russian economy and hurt the Kremlin and worry the Kremlin in a way that is not directly related to the battlefront, but which affects the ability of Russia to carry on as normal. And it gets through to the individuals in Russia, gets through to the citizenship in Russia, that this war is not without consequences. So they already know that their airports are disrupted on a regular basis, that their internal transport system is inconvenienced on a regular basis because of Ukrainian attacks. And as the price of petrol rises domestically, that will make the point again in the autumn of this year and the spring of next year. So in that respect, it's a successful campaign, which is carried out entirely, as far as we know, with Ukraine's own weapons, not using any Western weapons, which would be politically difficult, but with Ukraine's own weapons and its drones, it's been very effective.
You just mentioned about weapons. What kind of weapons do Ukrainians use to attack Russia's oil refining capacity? And could also Ukraine's new-made Flamingo missile also participate in such strikes sometime in the future?
Yes, the FP drones, the first-person drones, the FP1 is a very capable drone, which is mainly a battlefield drone, but longer-range drones and some improvisations of some of the old Tupolev missiles, which were actually reconnaissance missiles originally in the old Soviet stocks. The Ukrainian army has been able to repurpose them and put warheads onto them. Now, the Flamingo that you mentioned, that's the FP5. The Flamingo is a completely homegrown version of a powerful drone. It's got a long range, about 1,800 kilometers. It can carry a heavy warhead. And the thing is that our understanding is this is being produced at a rate of about 30 a month at the moment, but that rate will increase to 200 a month, it is believed, by the end of this year. And then next year, I would expect that rate to double or treble if the authorities in the Ministry of Defense and the procurement executive are able to source enough components, and they will have to disperse the production of the Flamingo in order to guard it from Russian attacks. But I think the advent of the Flamingo drone in particular lessens Ukraine's dependence on United States systems or European systems like Storm Shadow and Scalp, which still require United States approval for the targeting. So it gives Ukraine some real independence. And I think that if we're still talking about attacks on refineries in the spring of next year, I think that Ukraine will have a very capable series of drones around the Flamingo and other variations on that, which could actually maintain a very consistent tempo of operations against not just Russian petroleum and refining oil products, but other infrastructure targets if Ukraine chooses them carefully.
Could this force Vladimir Putin to seek any kind of compromise over Ukraine?
I doubt that this on its own is going to push Putin into a peace deal or a mood of compromise. But it increases the pressures on the Russian economy, and it increases the pressures on those around Putin, particularly the oligarchs, who must be able to see that this war is not good for them. It's not good for the long-term benefit of Russia. Ultimately, I have to say, the only thing now which will force Putin into being keen on a ceasefire or the idea of making genuine concessions, the only thing will be to lose territory on the battlefield. If he feels that his forces are being pushed back, then he will be much more keen on a ceasefire. But so far, his attitude has been whatever it takes in terms of human life and misery for the citizens of Russia, damage to the Russian economy. He's prepared to take all of that in order to keep pushing forward on the battlefield. So only when he loses ground on the battlefield will that change. But that's not to say that increasing the pressure on the Russian economy is not a good pressure for Ukraine to exert, because it affects the people around Putin, if not him directly himself.
Also, in one of your interviews at Sky News, you said that Russian army, you can't imagine that Russian army would be able to go into 2026. How much time do they still have for this war effort?
Well, I mean, the Russian army can keep on fighting, but it will get much harder for them into 2026 because the increase in war production in Russia has reached something of a plateau. They can keep increasing numbers, and they may get more help from North Korea and more help from China. That's entirely possible, and they're already getting quite a lot of help from Iran. So the Russians may find ways of maintaining the flow of weapons to the front line and their own weapon stocks and their own ability to create more weapons. But I don't think they'll be able to maintain this tempo of operations, this very high tempo that we've seen throughout 2025, through the winter and into the spring and summer of 2026. I mean, I think the Russians will try to mount an offensive sometime, probably not this year, but sometime early next year. But it would be surprising to me if such an offensive were very powerful, because they're pushing most of their available forces onto the front line immediately. I mean, we're not seeing any evidence of Russian forces being taken away from the front line for 6 or 8 months to train in a more efficient way of fighting the war. If they were back in Russia training, there'd be more expectation of a powerful offensive. But I think there'll be offensive operations, but probably more of the same. And when it comes to the fortress belt from Slavyansk to Kramatorsk to Druzhkivka and Kostiantynivka, the Russians are close to that fortress belt, but they've not been able to take it in almost 3 years. And I don't believe the Russians can conquer those cities until at least next year, even if they put all of their effort into it. I think those cities, although it's miserable living there, I think those cities are fairly safe, at least for well into 2026.
Let's cover situation on the ground. How can you assess the main results of Russia's summer campaign in Ukraine? And the second question would be about this belt of fortress. From your perspective, would the Russian army be able to capture these defense lines anytime soon in case of Putin conducting, for example, full-scale mobilization?
The Russians spent almost a year trying to capture Bakhmut and taking Bakhmut. And in the event, of course, they destroyed it before they were able to move in and occupy the rubble. And the fact is, Slavyansk and Kramatorsk are 3 times bigger than Bakhmut and better and fortified in a better position. And they're in a better geographical location on high ground with ridges to their east and so on. I think the Russians would have a real problem in trying to really break into any of those 4 big fortress cities from Slavyansk to Kostiantynivka. I don't think they can do it. So unless those fortress cities are given to them in some sort of crazy peace deal, which I don't believe will happen, they can't take them. Now, next year, if they were prepared to go in for full mobilization, then that might change the dynamic. But even so, they'd have to devote enormous resources because they are the most defensible parts of the whole front line as far as Ukraine is concerned. And, you will know better than me that Ukraine has fought for those cities since 2014. So they've held those cities as fortresses for 11 years now, and I don't think they'll fall very quickly. The point about the Russian offensives are that the Russians have changed their style, and they're now going in for, as it were, deep raiding. So as we saw in Dobropilya, they created raiding parties, small, not very well supported parties, to go deep inside or through Ukrainian lines to seize a little bit of territory, but they weren't able to follow up on it. And so although the Russians can creep forward with lightly armed troops, actually performing almost suicide missions, they can achieve some positions. They still find it hard to break through in a way that is strategically relevant. So that their tactics and their abilities are always to keep pushing across the whole front and make small gains wherever they can. And they are making gains. We've got to be completely honest about that. But none of these gains, none of them, seem like a breakthrough in terms of maneuver warfare. Because maneuver warfare requires, at some point, heavy forces with heavy armor being able to spearhead through a gap in the opponent's lines, in the enemy lines, and then circle around behind them to isolate a brigade or a corps, a significant number of troops, and thereby grab a large piece of territory. The Russians have not done anything like that since Lysychansk. The last place in which they conducted a little bit of that was when Severodonetsk was abandoned. Then Lysychansk was the next place on the other side of the river. The Russians did conduct something like a maneuver battle, but it was a fairly small-scale thing, and they've not managed anything remotely like that since. And I don't see any indication in their training or their tactics that they're able to do it anytime soon. So if we see them do it next year, they will have to put a lot of effort into retraining troops to do it properly.
Let's cover also political aspect of the war in Ukraine and these negotiations between the US, Russia and Ukraine. Russia is unwilling to organize a personal meeting between Ukrainian President Zelensky and Russian dictator Vladimir Putin, but do they still have any cards to play with Donald Trump to avoid possible sanctions? And don't you think that Russia has already used its all cards with Donald Trump by presenting this opportunity to conduct summit between Trump and Putin? And what comes next?
Well, the Russians clearly seem to believe that they can carry on doing what they're doing, and that ultimately the United States under Donald Trump will allow them to do it. That they seem to feel that they can continue the war in Ukraine because they know that Trump isn't interested in Ukraine as such. He wants to get the Ukrainian war out of the way, off his desk. Now, he also very much wants to be the peacemaker. He wants to convene a major international conference which would create at least a ceasefire. And that's not going to happen because Putin has convinced him now that a ceasefire is not relevant and he's got to go for the whole peace deal. He won't get it. I'm absolutely certain that there will not be a peace conference in any meaningful sense this year. I'm absolutely certain of that. Although the Americans talk about it and people are working towards it, as I've said on other occasions, all of this on the Ukrainian side, on the Russian side, on the European side, it's all shadow boxing to actually convince Washington that we are in favor of a peace conference if only it could happen. And that's what the Russians are trying to do, to say, well, yes, of course, we could have a peace conference, but we've got lots of things to sort out first, lots of things to be agreed first. And that's a way of keeping it in the distance, keep pushing it back. Whereas President Zelensky said in March he would agree to a 30-day ceasefire. President Zelensky has said repeatedly, I will meet President Putin. He said repeatedly that we can talk about a peace deal. We can talk about some of the things that would have to be discussed if Russia is prepared to come into the room with us. But so far, the Russians have backed away from that. And this whole diplomatic merry-go-round of the last 2 weeks since Alaska is based on, first of all, optimism from Steve Witkoff's visit to the Kremlin. Steve Witkoff came away from the Kremlin with a very vague idea that the Russians were prepared to make quite big concessions. The European partners of the United States were very skeptical about that. It didn't agree with any of their own interpretations of what Russia was doing. And since then, Steve Witkoff has changed his interpretation of what the Russians said to him. But on the basis of Witkoff's optimism, President Trump rushed towards the summit in Alaska, and suddenly it all dissolved because the Russians, surprise, surprise, are really not in the mood to make any concessions whatsoever. So what we're doing is going through a process of pretending that a peace conference is possible, whereas we all know it is not, but we all want to show good faith so that Donald Trump doesn't blame Zelensky and Ukraine for the collapse of peace talks, doesn't blame the Europeans for it. But equally, of course, the Russians are trying to maneuver Trump into a position where he does blame Zelensky for everything that is not happening on the peace talks front.
But don't you think that this Kremlin's decision to give Trump a personal meeting summit could turn into the biggest mistake ever? Because President Trump has invested so much his personal time, reputation and political effort in this big, widely covered summit with Vladimir Putin, and although he has invested lots of time, progress has not been made. Could this just turn Trump against Putin?
Yes, I mean, you're right. You're right in the sense that Trump is desperate for a big deal. He's desperate for an era-defining deal to bring this worst war in the world at the moment to an end. So he wants that, and the Russians are playing a very dangerous game in preventing him from having it. But it still comes back to the reality that every time President Putin and Donald Trump meet, and it's not just as heads of state. I mean, every time they've met in the last 10 or more years, and sometimes they've met at summits on the G20 or in the United Nations at the General Assembly. Sometimes they've had phone calls. Sometimes they've had internet meetings or meetings online. And then all the 2 or 3 direct summits they've had. Every single time, Putin dominates Trump. Putin dominates him intellectually, politically, and morally. And I think Putin, he may overplay his hand, but Putin seems to be very confident that he can manipulate Trump into blaming everybody else for, and particularly blaming Ukraine for the breakdown in talks. Of course, it may be that Donald Trump cannot let go of the idea of this major conference, which will secure his place in history. But I think he's already, if you look at his statements, they're very inconsistent, of course. Everything he does is inconsistent. But, I mean, a lot of his statements also are giving him the option of saying, well, I tried. It wasn't possible. I can't make 2 warring parties make peace if they won't make peace. And of course, in this respect, he's trying to blame both sides equally without any indication that he understands that this is a war of aggression of one state against another. Whereas Keith Kellogg made it very clear that these attacks were completely unacceptable and were attacks on civilians in Kiev, Caroline Levitt, who is the spokesperson for Donald Trump in the White House, she said, yes, of course, the Russians have attacked Kiev, and that's very bad. But equally, the Ukrainians have attacked oil refineries in Samara and Krasnodar, as if somehow attacks on military targets in Samara and Krasnodar are the moral equivalent of direct attacks on civilians in Kiev. And that indicates, of course, that the White House is preparing for at least one line of argument which says 2 sides equally to blame, won't stop fighting, so there's nothing I can do. And I think that is probably where Donald Trump is going to finish up in this conflict. I think that he is zigzagging his way out of any involvement in this war.
Let's cover also big discussions on security guarantees for Ukraine. According to Financial Times, US is ready to provide intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, command and control, and air defense assets to support European forces conducting possible peacekeeping mission in Ukraine. This also could include backing a no-fly zone over the Ukrainian territory. What is your take on these big discussions between Europeans and US team on the security guarantees?
Yeah, these are interesting discussions which are going on at a fairly low level between officials in the Pentagon and European defense ministries and in Ukraine as well, of course. Um, it is interesting that what the United States is now talking about is maybe some support in intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, in air defense, for the possibility of European forces stationed presumably in the western part of Ukraine as reassurance or deterrence forces. And Donald Trump seemed to have absorbed a little bit of that when he said we're talking about possible security guarantees, mainly in the air zone, I think he said, or in terms of air power, which seemed to give some credence to this. And again, it is interesting because the United States has moved from saying there will be no U.S. security guarantees or no backing for security guarantees to saying, well, maybe we'd back them up. So that may be a positive signal, but it's a very small signal because security guarantees will have to be quite big in order to make any difference to Ukraine's situation. And President Zelensky, I think, was very right when yesterday he said that with the discussion of security guarantees has got to be held at leadership level, not at the officials level, because officials can talk about these things all the time. It's what they do. They think about hypothetical ideas and planning ideas so that they give themselves the options that we can do this or we can do that or we do something else. And they look at how they'd use their resources. That's just an intellectual exercise. And what President Zelensky was saying is this has got to take place at leadership level, and any backup force or any security guarantees have got to be ratified through the parliaments of the countries involved. So they have to be formal treaty-based commitments. Now, I have to say, I think President Zelensky might be asking for too much when he says that, but I understand exactly why he says it. Because if Ukraine is to go into some sort of peace process and give up a great deal in that peace process, it has to have more than, as it were, vague security guarantees or security guarantees which are only agreed between defense ministries. It needs something which is much more constitutional and something which is a great deal stronger than the security guarantees it obtained in 1994 in Budapest. And that was a very good object exercise of what sort of security guarantees can be relied on and which cannot. So I think we're a little bit further forward on the question of security guarantees, but there's a long, long way to go. And I still think that all the discussion about security guarantees is actually shadow boxing around the reality that we all expect this peace process to fail. And we're trying to impress on Washington that we are trying our best to make it work, even though we don't believe it will work.
Also, according to politicals, there are also discussions about the possibility of deploying peacekeepers from the third country, from the neutral country. And there has been an interesting report by Financial Times that Trump reportedly proposed to deploy Chinese troops to Ukraine as in form of peacekeeping force. What is your assessment of this idea of the third country deploying troops to Ukraine? Is it a credible and real option?
Well, if there is to be any sort of structured arrangement after a peace treaty, then there would have to be some sort of third force involved. And for political reasons, as well as logistical reasons, it would make sense that a third force would have to be from a non-European country. Now, it may not have to be such a big force. Originally, President Zelensky said, well, we'd need probably about 190,000 troops to look after a border of 1,000 kilometers. And I know what he means. But it is possible you could envisage rather fewer troops than that, say 60 or 70,000, using a great deal of surveillance technology, of drones, of aerial surveillance, in which there might be some help from other countries to actually monitor what happens across the border. But whether it's a relatively small number of troops or a large number of troops, it is logical that those troops would have to be non-Europeans. And I think that's a reasonable assumption. Whether it's possible to find them is a completely different question. And whether Chinese troops would ever take on this role, I think is extremely doubtful. I mean, you'd be looking at troops, say, from Indonesia or Malaysia, possibly India, possibly Latin American countries. A number of the Latin American countries have got good records in deploying peacekeeping troops. And any European troops, which would be much smaller in number, we're talking about maybe 30,000, maybe 40,000 at the outside, they'd be a long way behind those lines, acting as a deterrent and a reassurance force. But again, I have to say, you can look at it on paper, you can draw a map with all these lines on it. My own political common sense tells me that we can plan for it, but it's almost impossible to see it happening, certainly this year.
And I would like also to cover final questions with you on your strategic view of this war. From your perspective, for how long Russia is ready to continue this effort before reaching any kind of a ceasefire deal?
The depressing thought is that Russia will continue with this war for as long as Putin is in power, deep into the 2030s, when he'll be a very old man, and maybe after he is replaced by somebody else. So because the Russian elite seem to believe that Ukraine has no right to exist as an independent state, and that goes deep into Russian thinking. The more optimistic version is that if it is possible to reverse Russian gains on the battlefield, that Putin may become much more pragmatic and decide that continuing with this war, which is wrecking Russia and is doing Russia no good whatsoever in the long run, is better to curtail and at least go for some sort of medium-term ceasefire. And so if it were possible that Russian gains are reversed in next year in some significant way, I think Russia's attitude would change. But it would still leave the basic problem that Ukraine is condemned to live for a long time with a potentially hostile neighbor much bigger than itself. And so Ukraine, I'm afraid, will have to be a heavily armed state, far into the future, and it will always feel relatively insecure. But if it is able to maintain some form of modus operandi, of some sort of stable ceasefire for a long enough period, for 10 years, for 15 years, then its own development as a sophisticated, democratic, prosperous state will make it all the more secure going into the later part of this century. So in the longer term, I think there is a lot that Ukraine can hope for. But in the short term, it has got to deal with Putin, who is determined to do whatever it takes to conquer Ukraine. And that will only be changed when his forces are somehow pushed back in significant numbers, in significant territories, preferably at least back to where they started from in 2022, and ideally, of course, further than that.
And my final question for you, don't you think that prospect of terrible situation with the economy and the prospect of possible another US tariffs against China, India could force Putin to change his thinking and reach at least some kind of temporary ceasefire?
If the United States was prepared to take strong sanctions against China and India and other countries like Turkey who deal in Russian oil, then it undoubtedly would make the Russian elite, not Putin, but it would make the Russian elite think again. But the chances of President Trump doing that are very small indeed, because he's got a bigger game he's playing with China, and he's very, very reluctant to introduce these tariffs that he's talked about. I mean, the congressional proposal was for tariffs of 500%. Secondary tariffs of 500%. President Trump then said, I'll introduce tariffs of 100%, he said, after 50 days. In the event, he introduced tariffs of 25% on one country rather than 100% on 3 or 4 or 5 different countries. And in that respect, he's not going to operate against China. Again, I go back to what I said before. The best thing that America can do to help Ukraine is to give it or sell it all of the weapons that it needs, because only victory on the battlefield will change Putin's mind as to when he has to become more pragmatic as opposed to obsessed as he presently is with the conquest of Ukraine.
Thank you, Professor Clarke, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Glory to Ukraine. I hope not to be having this conversation with you too many more times, because I hope that there'll be no necessity for it. But it's always a pleasure to speak to you, Daniel.